Welcome to our Simplify podcast. So my name's Giang Hughes and I'm speaking with Dom House. So Dom's our lead consultant at Simplify Consulting. Today, we're going to be discussing complaints, an integral function that provides any organisation with opportunities to serve the customer better. And also there to provide valuable prompts to review their performance and identify opportunities to make systemic improvements. So over to you, Dom. Let's start with how firms should be assessing the success of their complaints function.
Yeah, hi, Yang, thank you. Well, in terms of the success of a complaints function, I guess the first and foremost in a firm's mind should be, are we identifying where customer expectations haven't been met, where the outcomes that a customer expects or were signposted to them have not been right, and the customer's suffered as a result of that, whether that's financially or distress or whatever the case may be. I mean, the firm needs to make sure that they are carrying out an investigation where a customer has flagged that there is an element of dissatisfaction, and they need to make sure that they've carried out that investigation promptly, whether make sure that it's carried out in full, taken into account all of the various aspects that may have impacted on the customer and the outcomes, and obviously that the customer is then put right and they're compensated appropriately for any financial loss or distress. So ultimately, it is putting the customer first. That's how a firm needs to think about complaints.
So that's easy to say. So to say, we put the customer first and those successful outcomes. So let's look at it in detail. Does efficiency and productivity of the complaints function actually matter to be able to allow them to do that?
Well, the answer is yes and no, really. So there are certainly efficiency and productivity needs to be considered. First and foremost, there's regulatory timelines that the firm needs to meet. So if the complaints function is not operating in a way that allows those regulatory timelines to be met, then there is a failure there. So, firms need to acknowledge the complaint. They need to carry out the investigation and conclude it and communicate in the right timescales. So, yes, the firm needs to be considering that, but also to a certain extent, if you're thinking back about those right outcomes, really that is where the regulator is looking at things. So the FCA want to make sure that the complaint is investigated fully, completely, and is resolved at the earliest possible opportunity. So if a firm is carrying out that, whether it's, should they be trying to make it as productive as possible? Well, not if that means that there's a risk that those key requirements are not being met, and the firm is just trying to, push through the complaints and close them as quickly as possible.
So what you're saying is, whilst that's what the regulations require, the way that firms deal with that could imply something else and not actually helping the customer. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So the regulator would say that the focus needs to be on the customer. So where the efficiency and productivity comes into it is, does that mean that you're reaching the right conclusions as early as possible in the process? What the regulator isn't saying is just close the complaints as quickly as possible, get through as many as possible, and therefore you've got to meet your objectives. I think there is a balancing act there. I think there needs to be a degree of proportionality within it. So if the complaints are being resolved promptly, then that does mean that there needs to be a focus of outcomes on the complaints process itself.
Right.
So, there is the potential for conflict, but the decisions of how they're going to, that a firm is going to put in place their process and procedures, where they're going to put their policies in place, they need to be thinking both of customer outcomes and of, meeting that regulatory expectation. What we often see when we're working with firms is you can actually see the difference between a firm that is able to close complaints sooner. So yeah, they're really quick at closing those complaints in the first few days, first couple of weeks, but actually they tend to have a higher upheld rate. So they're upholding more of their complaints. That you would expect that the kind of link between those two things is that they are resolving complaints, but they're not doing as full an investigation as other firms, which may be taking longer to investigate, but are potentially getting closer to the root of the issue before they then come to a decision as to whether it's fair to uphold or decline the complaint on the customer. From a customer perspective, if you're upholding the complaint and potentially, giving a goodwill payment or resolving the issue, that's great. So they're kind of happy with a high upheld rate, but really, from a firm's point of view, are they doing everything necessary to make sure that A, they're investigating it properly, but also B, are they really understanding what caused the issue so they're able to address it?
So how will firms really know that they've got that right?
Well, what you've got to remember is that a complaint, a single complaint, could be the tip of the iceberg. So there could be a whole load of customers underneath that either aren't aware of the issue, they're not by nature going to complain. So one complaint could indicate a much wider issue. So if a firm isn't taking the time to investigate it properly, how do they know that they're not seeing an issue with the way that a product's been marketed or being sold that could affect a whole load more customers? So I would argue that it is better to take the time to investigate because that allows root cause analysis to take place. It allows the right identification of issues to take place. So whilst a firm may want to close complaints early and as quickly as possible, that can't be at the detriment of the customer or of the issue associated with the complaint.
Because I suppose that will impact the firm in the end, because if you're hiding actually a myriad of issues because you've not investigated further, then actually it's just going to keep coming back, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's certainly examples that I've seen in the past where a large scale project needs to be started to put a large number of customers in the right position because maybe the fee was wrong or the way that the correspondence was written is incorrect. You need to go through and address all of those customers. I'm not saying in every instance you're able to identify that really early because their complaint came in. Sometimes a complaint can lag behind the issue, but I just think that a complaint could be a warning sign of something much more fundamental that the business is able to resolve. And obviously, the sooner they resolve it, the better for the customer and the better for the firm if they don't have to go through that process of putting more customers right over a longer period.
Yeah, and I suppose it comes back to what you were saying about root causes.
Yeah, I think root cause is really important as part of complaints. What we tend to see is root cause is invariably done at almost all firms are doing it, but how it's done is really important because there are different ways of capturing the information and there's different ways of using that information. It's really important that when firms are capturing what the root cause is, they're able to roll that data up to understand what the trends are, and discuss it in the right forums, the right level of governance in place, the right seniority of people understanding what the root cause is. Too often it's too generic. It's very difficult to understand. If you say that there's a people error, for example, we've got a high number of people errors in a particular team. Well, is that down to headcount? Is there generally not enough people to do the work? Is it that there's a training issue? Is it that is it more cultural and related to maybe staff retention? Is it related to reward and recognition? There's a whole load of things that it could be related to. If a senior manager just sees people error, how are they meant to determine what the actions are required off the back of that? You've
Yeah.
got to use that root cause analysis and make it work for the level of forum and governance that it's being reviewed into.
Okay. So knowing that, you know, consumer duty obviously is a big topic at the moment. So what's the impact then really of consumer duty for complaints?
Well, yeah, it's a interesting question really, because in one sense, actually the impact you'd expect to be minimal, because if a complaints function is operating well at the moment and it's aligned to the idea of good customer outcomes, it's aligned to, you know, redressing issues that the customer has faced, then at that core, it is aligned with the consumer duty requirement. What I think will be more interesting is how is the firm viewing the information that they're getting from their complaints function? How are they using it? So root cause analysis being one, making sure that the firm really understands what's going wrong and using that information to put things right. So it could be that, you know, as we said, a marketing material is incorrect, maybe the wrong term, but a marketing material is causing customers to have different expectations of a product than the firm believed they would have. So how are they making sure that that is being fed back correctly into the right place within the business, and the good outcomes that consumer duty is trying to mandate towards firms, they are really understanding how complaints can be used to improve how they do things. So I think it's almost, you know, hopefully vast majority of firms, it won't be about addressing how they're dealing with complaints on an individual basis. It will be about using that information in the right way. It's a really good tool for consumer duty because it is direct feedback from the customer saying, this is where I think you've got it wrong.
So looking at that data and that sort of gathering and the analysis, what do firms have to do to be able to do that correctly? Because they're going to have a huge amount of information, aren't they?
Yeah.
So, you know, how do they process that? How do they know where to focus that?
Well, yeah. So I think obviously complaints will be one of many different metrics. So
Right.
firms need to work out, you know, what is the metric? What are the scorecards that we're going to use to measure consumer duty? And I'm obviously assuming that complaints is going to be one of them. So obviously, coming back to that point about root cause analysis, it's got to be meaningful. The data that you're getting from complaints needs to be meaningful. So obviously root cause being one of them, but also trends in terms of when are you seeing complaints coming in? So are you seeing a spike at a certain period after a large communication has gone out? Okay, are you understanding how those two things are linked? Understanding what the event is that's causing the complaint and being able to track that appropriately, because that's going to be really important information. There's obviously a lag. Often there's a lag between an event happening and complaints coming through. So in one sense, it can be complaints can be the last part of that event kind of being fed through, but it's also a really important metric to understand what the impacts were of that event on customers. And it's understanding, you know, how are the complaints spread across the year? All of those things, what team is it impacting in? What products is it impacting in? They're all really important information, but they have to be rolled up and presented in a way that senior managers can really understand.
And pulling those space, that holistic view, isn't it? From all the different areas to be able to give them that. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
So, so let's think about the current economic climate. You know, it's difficult times at the moment. There's also a cost of living crisis. How do you feel that's going to impact? Because, you know, customers are feeling the pinch, and that's going to have a real impact on them, their finances, and the way that they interact with a lot of firms. So how do you see that manifesting itself, I suppose, in terms of how complaints are handled and firms dealing with that?
Yeah. So well, firms obviously, I'm sure a lot of firms are experiencing the impact of the current economic climate, the cost of living crisis, etc. There are obviously a section of society, you know, a growing section of society that are finding previously affordable products and services may be less affordable than they were previously. Obviously, there will be certain individuals and groups struggling with their incomes, especially if we start to see employment rising over the next period. So that's something that firms are going to have to be increasingly aware of. Obviously, vulnerability is a really important part of this. So are firms identifying vulnerable customers appropriately? Do they have the right policies and procedures in place to deal with those vulnerable customers effectively? The vulnerable customers can be, transitory, so it can be effective. They've just had an income shock or something like that. So for this period of time, they are vulnerable and they do need to be accounted for in terms of how you treat them, and therefore that will play out into the resolution of the complaints. There is obviously a need for senior managers to be engaged in that process to make sure that the policies and procedures are reviewed and updated. I think the pandemic was a really good example of how those things can happen relatively quickly. And obviously things changed very rapidly during the pandemic because of similar issues and really that are happening now. So similar issues where there's an increase in vulnerability, where there's potential individuals which are having issues of affordability, etc. It's almost the pandemic set a precedent for how firms should act in similar circumstances. And I think this year coming up could be one of those.
So do you think firms will be as agile? Because obviously the pandemic was a big, hard-hitting sort of moment in time in terms of the impact it had on people. With what we're seeing at the moment, this is sort of creeping up on us. It's visible, we know it's there, but actually, do you think firms are going to be agile enough to be able to start thinking quite quickly about how they put this in place, having had COVID as a really good sort of setup and precedent?
Yeah, I think they should be harnessing how they acted under the pandemic to assess what they need to do now. I would say that my experience is that firms are doing that, and I think if firms aren't doing that, they should really consider whether they need to with Consumer Duty coming up. Because I would say that if you are not adjusting your policies, procedures, the way you deal with complaints to adapt to the current economic climate, I would say that you're going to have a hard time justifying good outcomes for customers.
Okay. So in summary, what would you say would be the sort of top maybe 2 or 3 things that firms need to focus on to ensure they've got a really successful complaints function?
So I think firms do need to take into account and understand where they sit and where they want to sit in terms of that balancing act between efficiency and good outcomes for customers. I think firms need to make a decision about, are they in the right place? Are they investigating complaints thoroughly enough, or are they just trying to close things sooner? Versus firms that potentially may be going too far the other way and investigating things too long. So that's certainly one thing that I would look at. And I think data is going to be massively important going forward. It already should be, but I think firms need to look at what they're currently doing, and I think they need to ask themselves some tough questions as to whether they are really getting the right information in front of the right people at the right level. Because I think that too often it's kind of considered a bit BAU of, okay, here comes our monthly complaints report. Right. Oh, okay, there's the graph, it's going up or down. Okay, that's interesting. How are you actually going to use that? Because I don't think that's going to suffice going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your insights, Dom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.